So now we turn to the Constitution, and we've been looking at the new nation. We've been looking at how the new nation figure out its shape and form, and what we're trying to decide what kind of nation it's going to be. And as people were discovering throughout the 1780s, it was one thing to protest against things that you didn't like in government, as the Americans had during the Revolution, and it was quite another thing to come up with an alternative and to come up with something better and then to get others to agree. And I want to stress that the Constitution was not inevitable. And I know that's obvious on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's so ingrained in us. I think that it's a great idea that of course it would happen sooner or later. That I feel the need on the outset of this lecture to say that obviously it was not inevitable. And we think to ourselves, well, of course the Articles, what a goofy government the Articles Confederation was. Of course they've got to come down with something better. Of course it's going to be stronger, and of course it's going to end up looking just like our Constitution. And obviously the problem with that whole river of courses is that if you travel down that stream, you miss one of the most important aspects of the process of creating a constitution, and that it was the process, that it was a debate. It was a national debate during which people really seriously considered what they were doing, what the implications were of what they were doing. So the process, the fact that there actually was a debate is extremely significant, and it's not a process that went entirely disconnected from the Revolution. And the things that Americans had been yelling about during the Revolution, they talked in a variety of different ways about liberties. They talked in a variety of different ways about rights, and people were truly arguing about the defending specific fundamental rights and privileges that they felt they deserved as British subjects. And of course, the end result about that fight was the Revolution. Now, given that I'm going to have a little short time to talk about the Constitution, what I really want to focus on is the process of creating it. And in doing that, I'm going to talk about a handful of controversies, ongoing controversies, that we've seen before, during the Revolution, in an earlier part of this course, and we're going to see them again towards the end of this lecture when we focus on some of the main areas that became controversies of the Constitutional Convention. Now, I think in the same way that we have all of these of courses, of course we know what's going to happen, it's the Constitution. I think it's only easy for us to talk down the of course, to walk down the of course trail when we think about nationalists like James Monroe or Alexander Hamilton. Now, on some sort of basic level, we assume, well, they're right? They're the smart guys, they're right, and everyone who's against them is sort of a short-sighted, limited-minded person who clearly isn't thinking on a broad, smart level. And I think almost instinctively, because we think what we think about our Constitution, we think that way about whoever supported it or did not. Now, certainly these nationalists felt like they were vindicating the Revolution. So if you'd asked them, they would have told you that they felt they were preserving the achievements of the Revolution, and they were fending off chaos and a variety of other things that would defeat what had been won in the Revolution. And from our vantage point, we look back and we see that, and that makes sense. But this wasn't the only argument that was circulating at the time. So even before the Constitutional Convention met, people had valid fears about what might result from it. And they were fears that were strong enough for some people didn't even think their states should even participate in the convention, never mind arguing about ratification. There were many people who just thought their state should not participate in this whole idea of revising the government. And in some way or another, some people feared that strengthening the national government was a kind of counterattack against everything that the Revolution had meant. So now I'm going to kind of give some sense to the flavor of this debate, this actually sort of pre-convention debate in which the states are figuring out what to do. And remember in our last lecture we talked about the creation of state governments and state constitutions. So there had been debates going on in the states prior to coming together and writing the articles and then discussing whether or not they should make changes in a constitutional idea. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the debates that were going on in Connecticut after the Confederation. Congress had passed a resolution saying, okay, We think the state should select delegates to send them to this convention that's going to happen to revise the articles. So, as the slide says, the goals of the nationalists were to preserve the achievements of the revolution, fending off chaos. And of course, there was this fear of strong national government. So let's hear what some of these men from Connecticut decided when they were trying to make decisions about going to this convention. So on May 12, 1787, the Connecticut legislature began debating whether Connecticut should send delegates to this proposed convention to meet in Philadelphia. That was coming up very soon, as a matter of fact. And now most newspapers that reported on what happened explicitly mentioned 4 members of the Connecticut House who came forward and declared that they were opposed to sending delegates to the convention. Now all of these men were from small towns near the Massachusetts border, and all of them in one way or another warned that sending a delegate to this convention would endanger the liberties and privileges of Americans. Okay, so first on our list is Elijah Fitch. He said the convention might end up abridging the people's privileges by creating some kind of big, unjust, centralized government that just wouldn't consider the individual person at all. Pretty bold claims. Daniel Perkins said that the men who probably would be named as delegates to this supposed convention would probably be a bunch of rich, aristocratic type men who wouldn't understand or care about the problems of the average person in Connecticut, never mind the poor of Connecticut. So Perkins thought whatever comes out of this convention is bound to just ruin the poor. It's going to be some weird, aristocratic decision. That maybe even abridging some of the privileges like Elijah Fitch brought up. The third gentleman, Josiah Humphrey, said that the convention would probably somehow or other take away the rights of Connecticut to protest against things and to veto things. Somehow or other it's going to be more centralized. So Connecticut is going to lose power in this equation. And the fourth representative, a gentleman by the name of Abraham Granger, was particularly straightforward. He said he knew that his constituents didn't want delegates to be sent to this convention, and he represented them. He had no choice. He had to do what they wanted him to do and say. He actually thought that this convention was a bad idea, and he stated specifically the reason why he didn't like the whole idea of a convention was that probably it would end up creating a monarchy, and then we would be right back to where we were before the revolution. So all these men, either directly or by implication, clearly rejecting the idea that the Union or Connecticut in general is in such horrible shape that something must be done. We need a new government. They're not traveling down that trail. Granger actually, in the course of his remarks, explicitly said that the Confederation Congress had plenty of power. The Articles of Confederation joined with Connecticut's own Constitution would be just fine for the people of Connecticut. Now, implied in some of these comments of what these men said is the idea that anything could happen at this convention. And obviously that's something I've talked about before in this course as well. But you can hear it underlying a lot of their comments. Who knows what's going to come out of this convention? Anything could happen. And odds are whatever happens, some fundamental American privileges and rights are going to be taken away, potentially by a bunch of wealthy aristocratic guys who are going to be on one standing to be the one standing in that room in Philadelphia debating. So they're basically imagining the convention is going to be a bunch of aristocrats who are going to subvert a popular revolution and maybe even just toss the new country right back into a monarchical form of government. So those are the 4 people who at least a newspaper noted as really standing forth against the convention. Now, of course, the newspapers also reported on 9 men who spoke in favor of attending the convention, and all of them were from commercial areas. They all argued, as you would expect them to argue, that the well-being of the Union and the well-being of the state of Connecticut really required a stronger central government. And one of these 9 even brought up an embarrassing example of how powerless the Congress was that involved Connecticut. He said to the convention, to the members in Connecticut, he said, recently the Confederation Congress asked the states, including Connecticut, that they requisition money from us, and we just decided we didn't feel like giving them any, and they couldn't do anything. They asked us for something, and we said no, and that was the end of that. They don't have power because we watched them not have power when we just said no. And this one delegate, went to say, he said, think about that. That's not even a problem. What about problems to come? What if the Union begins to disintegrate? What if the Union is invaded? What would the Confederation Congress be able to do about problems like that? So obviously, in the end, it's that kind of argument that wins out, and Connecticut voted to send delegates to the convention. But obviously, also not without a real debate. So even participating in the convention was a big deal that required serious debate, and we haven't even gotten to ratification yet. Okay, so let's take a look at this convention that they had. So ultimately, 12 states sent delegates to the Federal Convention. And I should add here, just not to confuse you, sometimes I know I'm saying Federal Convention, and sometimes I'm saying Constitutional Convention, and there are two ways of referring to the same thing. Some historians say federal, because if you think about it, every state could have a constitutional convention, but there can actually be maybe, hopefully, one federal convention, but you can use either one. Okay, so 12 states sent delegates to the Federal Convention. It met between May and September of '87. Rhode Island was not there. From those 12 states, 55 delegates attended the convention in all, and I suppose, as you might expect, overall they were well-educated men. A lot of them were trained as lawyers. A lot of them had experience working in their state governments. And a good number of them had experience serving in their continental congresses or the Confederation Congress. Now that said, this doesn't mean that these were sort of professional politicians sitting down to write a constitution. It's not as though they've prepared their lives for this moment. They're people who've been involved in public life, but they certainly have not been trained to sit down and create an entire constitution for an entire country. So despite that experience, which I'm sure served them well, it does not suggest that they actually are just ready to go. They're not entirely sure what's going to happen. Now, in some ways, these delegates were kind of a self-selecting group, because people who were really dead set against the idea of strengthening the national government just didn't go to the convention. By not being there, they made it easy to achieve a consensus among the people who were there, who were a little more comfortable with strengthening the national government. Most of the people who were there in one way or another ended up being nationalists in some form, and by nationalists I actually don't just mean the James Madisons of the world. There's a pretty wide spectrum of people thinking about the fact that the national government needs to be stronger, and some of them, Hamilton, Madison, extremo nationalists, others not so much. There were some people at the convention who weren't even necessarily comfortable with the great amount of increased strength and did not end up signing the Constitution. So I'm not saying everyone there is a firm nationalist, but the really firm, I suppose you'd call them at this moment, anti-nationalists, didn't go for the most part. So since they were not there, it meant that there was a certain sort of fundamental level of agreement at the convention. Now, two of the delegates there were particularly well known. And to people who were wondering what the heck was going on in Philadelphia, the presence of these two men made a big difference. George Washington was there and ended up presiding over the convention, which ended up being a pretty important move. I've already talked in other lectures and other courses about how he gained the trust of everybody by continually surrendering his power. So he's already a legend in his time, but also he's a trusted leader. So certainly having him there gave a certain status to whatever was going on. It meant that it was important and meant that it was something that was being treated responsibly because George Washington had invested it with his presence. Benjamin Franklin also attended. Again, he's another American who had an international reputation. Like Washington, his presence there supported that whatever the heck was going on in Philadelphia, it was important and it had some major support. The fact that these two men were there was significant. This is not the reason why he was there, but I also am always happy when someone is anywhere who has a sense of humor, so Franklin had one, and it's always good to have the guy with a sense of humor at any large meeting of men who have important things to say. So for that reason, I personally am happy that Benjamin Franklin was there. Now Madison also played a major role. His notes ended up being even more significant because it was agreed at the start of the convention that its proceedings would be kept entirely secret. The logic of that being that it was if it was really kept entirely secret, the people who would there would feel free to think to really speak their minds. They really wanted an open, full, honest debate, which will come up later in this lecture. And there's actually a story about the secretary of the Federal Convention, which I'll offer you because it's also a George Washington story. It really is a way of showing how important people at the time considered the idea of keeping the convention secret. And it's from the notes of a delegate who was there at the convention. His name is William Pierce. And supposedly at some point in the convention, somebody found a page of notes about the proceedings on the floor of the State House and brought this up to George Washington and said, somebody lost these. So Washington takes the lost notes, and at the end of the day's session, he stands up and he says, "Before we adjourn, gentlemen, I'm sorry to find that one member of this body has been so neglectful of the secrets of the convention as to drop in the State House a copy of his proceedings, which by accident was picked up and delivered to me this morning. I must entreat, gentlemen, to be more careful, lest our premature speculations disturb the public repose by getting into the newspapers. I know not whose paper it is." And then he said, "But there it is." And he sort of threw it down on the table and added, "Let him who owns it take it." And according to Pierce, he bowed, picked up his hat, and left the room, quote, "with a dignity so severe that every person seemed alarmed." So, Pierce writes that immediately everyone started checking their pockets and their notes. Pierce says to his horror he discovered that his were lost. So he kind of goes up to the front of the room and he kind of peeks at the notes, and he's really relieved to discover that they're not his. That means that his notes are lost. That means two people's notes are lost. And Pierce then later says that he remembered, "Oh yeah, I left them in my coat pocket in the boarding house where I'm staying." And he found them and he got them, and hopefully everything was okay. But I love the fact that he's really relieved. And according to Pierce, Washington's reprimand was so off-putting that nobody ever claimed the piece of paper. It would just stay there, that scary piece of paper, through the entire convention. So obviously Madison's notes are important, also partly because this was very secret. But of course, what's particularly significant about Madison's role in the convention is his creation of a plan of government, which ultimately is known as the Virginia Plan. Excuse me. Madison arrived at the convention with a plan of government in hand. So in a sense, he immediately set the terms of debate, and it was a really strategic move. Now, he really does something very brilliant strategically by walking in, and regardless of what is going to happen, he literally at least started out by setting the terms of the debate. Now, he may have devised this plan of government, but given that people already knew he was sort of an extreme nationalist, he wisely decided he would not stand up and present his plan himself, thinking, and probably rightly so, that if he stood up and made a recommendation, some people would immediately distrust it as coming from some kind of an extreme nationalist. So instead, he asked fellow Virginia delegate Edmund Randolph to present the plan. And Randolph was popular, and Randolph was influential, and unlike Madison, he was also a good public speaker, so it was a wise choice. So on May 29th, just a few days after the convention opened, Randolph stood up and very diplomatically and very gently opened the subject of altering the articles. Though, as you're about to see, what he ends up suggesting is not altering the articles. So first he reviewed the weaknesses of the articles, and then he proposed a series of resolutions. The first one intended to just calm the nerves down and sort of put people off guard. Nothing scary is happening here. So he first says, resolved that the Articles of Confederation ought to be so corrected and enlarged as to accomplish the objects proposed by their institution, namely common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare. So Randolph there says he's proposing to correct and enlarge the articles. Now, what followed that statement was a rather radical plan of government that was not a correction of the articles. Instead, it pretty much proposed to demolish the articles and create in their place a strong national government that would be grounded not on the individual states, but instead on the people themselves. And this plan of government, the Virginia Plan, is ultimately what it's called, proposed that the new government would have three branches. The first would be a bicameral legislature. The lower house would be elected by the people. The upper house would be selected by the lower house from candidates named by the state legislators. The legislator would have the power to nullify any state law contrary to the Constitution, and representation in the lower house is based on population. Now, the second branch was the national executive, and in the Virginia plan, the executive would have a qualified veto over acts of Congress. The plan didn't specify whether the executive would be a single individual or committee. People talked about both, and the term of office wasn't specified either. And then obviously the third branch was the national judiciary, which would consist of one or more supreme judges, some inferior courts to be chosen by the national government to hold office during good behavior. So again, as the chart says here, bicameral legislature, lower house elected by the people, upper house elected by the lower house from candidates named by state legislators. The legislator can nullify any state law that violates the Constitution. Representation is based on population. Branch 2 is the executive, who has a qualified veto over acts of Congress. It's not specified, one person, many people, how long you should be in office. And then the third branch, judiciary, with one or more supreme judges chosen by the national legislature holding office during good behavior. The Virginia plan also included a flexible amendment process and a procedure for the admission of new states. Now, as you can hear there, the basic outline of the final Constitution is kind of sitting there in that plan. A sort of fundamental frame of what's coming in the next few months is contained within the Virginia plan. So from the start of the conventions, things look a little auspicious for the nationalists. And sure enough, relatively early on in the convention, there's a vote that a new national government ought to be established, and it should have a supreme legislative, executive, and judiciary branch. Now that's a pretty major thing to decide, and it's a pretty major victory for people who are really firm nationalists. Now the convention now has committed to setting up a supreme central government with 3 branches, and some more nationalist victories followed. Then they began to discuss representation in the lower house of the legislature. And I'm also going to come back to representation in a few minutes, but for now I'll simply state the obvious, which is, of course, this debate broke down into small states versus large states. Small states not liking the idea of having representation be based on population, large states being perfectly happy with that idea. And small states had a good reason to fear that their influence would just be eliminated in some degree if everything is based on population. So on June 15th, William Paterson of New Jersey proposed his own plan, which becomes the New Jersey Plan. And of course, this is a plan that's much more popular among small state representatives. The New Jersey Plan suggested a one-house legislature, in which obviously each state would have one vote. There would be a plural executive, so an executive consisting of more than one person, who would be elected by the Congress, and a Supreme Court chosen by the executive. Now you can see how in some ways there are little vestiges of the Articles sitting there in that plan. There's a unicameral legislature. Each state has one vote. Even though this is supposedly a less centralized, less scary alternative to the Virginia plan, still it's giving more power to the national government than the Articles had done. Now, 3 days later, someone successfully moved to postpone consideration of the New Jersey Plan and instead consider simply revising the Articles. And now, at this point, Alexander Hamilton stood up and made a dramatic move. Now, on June 18th, he made what some describe as a 6-hour speech. I can't imagine giving or listening to a 6-hour speech, in which he proposed his own plan of government, which, as you'll hear, is really, really centralized and national. So, basically, Hamilton's plan reduced the states to administrative subdivisions. Each would have a supreme executive appointed by the national government, a chief executive elected for life during good behavior, elected by electors who were elected by electors who were popularly chosen. Okay, how removed can we get the people from the process of choosing the executive? Hamilton also proposed a Senate chosen for life during good behavior and an executive with absolute veto power. Now, that's way out there in scary land, and you can imagine he gives a 6-hour speech and that's what he comes up with. He also, during the speech, praised the British government as the best government on the face of the earth. So basically, Hamilton never lives down this speech. And as a delegate later put it, Hamilton's dramatic speech was praised by everybody, but supported by none. And it really did haunt him to the end of his days, because it seemed to be eternal proof to anybody who even vaguely didn't like him that he was really a monarchist at heart. That he's just waiting for a chance to convert the government into a monarchy with a king at its head. Now you can see why it was important to keep the proceedings secret, and you can see why they did not remain a secret for very long. Clearly they leaked. Now the question is, why did he stand up and give that speech? Why did he stand up and praise the British government as being the best government on the face of the earth? Why did he propose this extreme plan, knowing how people felt about some of these ideas? Some historians assume that this was a strategic move, and that Hamilton was trying to push the convention past the weak New Jersey plan, or horror of horrors, just revising the articles. So according to his strategy, Hamilton's plan would have looked so extreme that the Virginia plan would look really good in comparison. And sure enough, not long after Hamilton's speech, the New Jersey plan is defeated. However, it's equally possible that Hamilton wanted at least a moment to stand up and offer his ideas. Here's this guy who was roughly for a decade has been saying we need a stronger national government. He's one of the first, he's one of the strongest, he's consistent, he's out there. This is his message. And he finally gets the Constitutional Convention, and the other two delegates from New York do not like the idea of really strengthening the national government very much. And it's one state, one vote, so basically his vote doesn't matter at all. So for one reason or another, who knows whether it was strategic or because he wanted his moment to lay out his plan, the fact is that night after he gave that amazing speech, he did meet with Madison and revise Madison's notes so that they would be an accurate reflection of what he said, just in case anyone didn't hear him praise the British government as the finest on the face of the earth. Now, I'm about to do a really grave injustice to the Constitution. And so now is the moment when the founders will be spinning in their graves, because I'm going to basically condense my discussion of the Constitution down to three main ideas. Not because they're the only issues that should be discussed, but because certainly they're all important issues, and because they show something about how issues of the Revolution continue to play a role in American politics and American public life. And I apologize to the founders for condensing the Constitution down into mere minutes. So, the first issue that I want to discuss is representation. And the question here, the obvious one, population or one state, one vote. Small state, big state battle. Small states are afraid of having no influence, which they continue to be afraid of. And this is not a battle that stops once this decision is made. It continues on, and in one way or another, states are always sort of objecting. There's a potential secession plot by New England in the early 19th century because they feel that they have no influence. So this doesn't go away. But certainly at this point, it's a real sticking point. And ultimately, a committee came up with a solution, which is known either as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise. And the reason why it's the Connecticut Compromise is because it was proposed by Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman. And the compromise says representation in the House will be based on population, and in the upper house, one state, one vote. And that gets passed on July 16th, 1787. So representation, the first issue. Second major issue, though, in a way, the problem with this one is that it was not a major issue. It was the question of slavery, which clearly is linked to the question of representation. And on August 8th, northern states attacked slavery on moral grounds and proposed taking no account of slaves as part of the population when allocating representation in the national legislature. Now, obviously, many Southerners did not like this idea, and they defended slavery on moral and economic grounds, and they were joined by some Northerners who were afraid that this issue was just going to dissolve the Union. Now, Governor Morris of Pennsylvania offers a nice sort of example of the anti-slavery point of view, and I'll quote Morris here. He says, "Upon what principle is it that slaves shall be computed in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? The houses in this city, Philadelphia, are worth more than all the wretched slaves which cover the rice swamps of South Carolina. The admission of slaves into the representation, when fairly explained, comes to this, that the inhabitant of Georgia and South Carolina, who goes to the coast of Africa, and in defiance of the most sacred laws of humanity, tears his fellow creatures from their dearest connections and damns them to the most cruel bondage, shall have more votes in the government instituted for protection of rights of mankind than the citizen of Pennsylvania or New Jersey, who views with a laudable horror so nefarious a practice. Other side of the argument, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina was among those who stood up and tried to justify slavery. An example of his argument, he said, "If slavery be wrong, it is justified by the example of all the world. In all ages, one half of mankind have been slaves." And he cited Greece and Rome and other ancient city-states, as well as sanctions given to slavery in modern times. So slavery is mentioned. Slavery has its moment of debate, but it's important to note it was, in a sense, a little more than a moment. It only occupied a few days. The issue was recognized to be a deal breaker, and when the delegates held up their concern over slavery against the idea of forming a union, they just decided not to confront the issue at all. And they memorialized their inability to confront the issue in the document, the Constitution itself, in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, and Article 1 deals with Congress, and it states that, quote, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to 1 year 1808, which basically says Congress can't stop the slave trade before 1808. Which, it's interesting when you look at that part of the article, slavery isn't mentioned at all, which there's no issues of slaves mentioned in the Constitution. But look at how indirect that language is. It doesn't say that what I just said in very simple terms, the importation of such persons as any of one of the states shall think proper to admit. Can there be a more indirect way of referring to slavery? They're kind of tap dancing around this issue. They're finding one way or another just not to confront it. So the word slave and the word slavery, as I just said, does not appear in the Constitution. So basically, faced with the pretty fundamental moral problem, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention looked the other way, and in their minds, the Union was too tenuous for anything this controversial to be addressed. And this kind of sort of skipping out or not confronting the issue because it seems like a deal breaker would be seen again and again and again, and obviously, eventually it becomes a deal breaker, and it does contribute to the breaking of the Union. So, representation, slavery, two large issues under debate, or not under debate, depending on which one you're talking about. The third issue I want to bring up concerned the national executive, and obviously that really had links to the Revolution. The Revolution was a revolt against strong centralized power in the form of a monarchy and a monarch. And we've seen in previous lectures how state constitutions that were created in the 1770s really showed this ongoing fear of tyrannical centralized executive power. So we've seen when we were looking at those state constitutions how more often than not legislatures were given more power and governors were denied some powers. And it's the same fear and the same spirit that's charging the debate during the convention. So questions about the national executive come up again and again. How should he be elected? By electors chosen by state legislators, by state governors, by the national legislature, by popular election. How long should he serve? Proposals ranged from 2 years to life during good behavior. The ultimate compromise suggested that the president would serve for a 4-year term, and it didn't set a limit on how often he would be reelected. And he'd be elected by electors in the separate states, which reassured delegates that they were worried about states' rights, and each state could decide for itself how to select its electors. So, if a state wanted to select electors by popular election, they could. If a state wanted to have their legislator pick electors, they could. Again, they're sort of allowing the states to come up with their own way of doing this. States still have rights, but still big, scary issues of the executive. So in a way, all of these sort of compromises and decisions end up creating an executive who, at least it felt like he was being controlled in some way every 4 years by having to face election. So this brings us to the end of this lecture on the creation of the Constitution and the debates that ensued during the convention. In the next lecture, we're going to actually discuss whether or not the Constitution itself should be or is a democratic system. And we'll talk about that more in detail in the next lecture.